Morning, everyone. We begin with breaking news from overnight and what could be a very worrying development in Ukraine if verified. A report of a possible chemical attack in the besieged city of Mariupol. This, the tweet from the Foreign Secretary. She says reports that Russian forces may have used chemical agents in an attack on the people of Mariupol. We are working urgently with partners to verify details. Any use of such weapons would be a callous escalation in this conflict, and we will hold Putin and his regime to account. Reaction from the US as well. The Pentagon press secretary saying they're aware of the reports that Russian forces have deployed a potential chemical munition in Mariupol. John Kirby says, if true, it's deeply concerning. The city's mayor says more than 10,000 civilians have died. He said that number could surpass 20,000 as weeks of attacks and privation leave bodies carpeted through the streets, in his words. His comments come as Russian forces continue to turn their attention to the east of Ukraine, with pictures emerging of soldiers from the Donetsk People's Republic militia conscript moving through the city of Mariupol. In his nightly address to the Ukrainian people, the president, Volodymyr Zelensky, warned of the threat of Russian chemical attacks.
One
of the Russian occupiers said that they might use chemical weapons against the defenders of Mariupol. We consider it very seriously. I'd like to remind the world leaders that Russia's possible use of chemical weapons has already been discussed. At that moment, it meant that the reaction to the Russian aggression had to be much more severe and faster.
Well, let's find out what's happening in Kiev, should we, this morning. And standing by for us is Deborah again. Hi, Deborah. Good morning to you. Concerns that there could be have been some sort of chemical attack. Where are we with that?
Well, the figures that you just gave show that the situation in Mariupol, even before these latest allegations, was horrific. The idea of 10,000 people, civilians, already having been killed. It's a city that has been under siege since the beginning of this war. And the worry has been, as Russian forces fail to take the city, could they escalate and deploy some kind of chemical weapon? What we're hearing so far is nothing confirmed, but it's interesting, of course, and notable that the Foreign Secretary felt it's suitable to tweet that the UK is urgently working to verify the details of these reports. The reports about a chemical agent, we don't know exactly what it could be, and of course it's not confirmed yet.
OK, Deborah, thank you. Let's find out, if we can, what the British government is aware of. James Heappey, Minister for Armed Forces, is with us now. Hello to you, Mr Heappey. Thank you for joining us.
Morning, Kay.
What do we know about this alleged attack? Apparently, reports of a drone, people with breathing issues and dizziness.
So nothing more than your reporting, I'm afraid. We know that there are reports of the use of chemical weapons. We have not been able to verify those ourselves. And indeed, the Ukrainian system, as you've seen from President Zelensky, are only referring to the fact that there are reports. They themselves haven't yet been able to confirm to us that they have been used.
The US President Joe Biden said on the 24th of last month that if chemical weapons were used in Ukraine, that was a red line. If it's proven, what happens next?
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, these are appalling weapons to even think about using, and the fact that they are part of the discussion is deeply sobering. It's not just the President of the United States, the Presidents of France and our own Prime Minister have also been clear that there are weapons that simply should not be used, and if they are used, people will be held to account. I think it's useful to maintain some ambiguity, Kay, over exactly what the response would be, but let's be clear, if they are used at all, then President Putin should know that all possible options are on the table in terms of how the West might respond.
Could we go as far as to say a considered but effective response?
Well, it would certainly be effective, but it would also be well considered. I think that's a very good way of putting it. But it's important to recognise that there are all sorts of ways in which these things could be used, from the use of tear gas, which is effectively a riot control measure, all the way through to utterly devastating, lethal chemical weapon systems. So I don't think it's helpful to be too binary about the situation, because these are highly nuanced. But I also think it's very important to be very clear with your viewers, who I think have a deep sense of what is right and what is wrong, that there are some things that are beyond the pale, and the use of chemical weapons will get a response, and all options are on the table for what that response could be.
As a military man, I know that you will have a view on this. The 36th Naval Infantry Brigade have been doing their best to try to protect the people of Mariupol and to hold the line for 47 days now. They have commented on their Facebook page to say that they are running out of ammunition and there is little else that they can do. A thought for them?
Just amazing heroism. Within my regiment, the Rifles, one of the things that we celebrate the most was what happened in the Battle of Calais, which was a sort of to hold Calais whilst the Dunkirk evacuations were going on. And when I read the stuff from the Marines in Mariupol last night, I was kind of reminded of just that, the extraordinary courage that it takes to just keep fighting as ammunition runs low and you know that your chances of resupply are limited. And yet your sort of sense of patriotism, your sense of duty to your country, your knowledge that the longer you fight, the longer you hold out, the more opportunity it gives others to be ready for what comes next. I just think they're amazing people, and they epitomise everything that we've come to admire about the Ukrainian armed forces over the last 6 weeks.
Lord Richard Dannett, former head of the British Army, who I'm guessing you would have served under during your time in the military, says that Russia is on the brink of genocide in Ukraine. What are your thoughts?
I think that we have seen the most appalling images brought to us over the last few weeks as Russia. There's something. It's great to see Deb Haynes back in Kyiv. It's great to see that Kyiv is coming back to some sort of normality. But as we saw those troops withdraw last week from Bucha and Hostomel and Irpin, the pictures we saw were just appalling. And yet, those are the places that we've been able to get cameras into. What it must look like, how many dead there must be in the cities and towns that have been under siege for the last 6 weeks and that we haven't yet been able to get cameras into. It is just the most monstrous loss of life that is a deliberate tactic used by the Russians to besiege cities and impose cost on the civilian population that has remained. Lord Dannett used the word genocide. I would just say that whatever is going on in Ukraine from the Russians is extraordinarily bleak, and I think that the resolve of the Ukrainian people and President Zelensky to keep fighting and to win back their territory is amazing. The cost is enormous. Putin, however, will be held to account, and so too will everybody who serves in his government and the chain of command who have been responsible for these atrocities.
Talk to me about Imran Khan, if you would please, domestic politics. He's been convicted of a sexual act against a child. Should he resign?
Well, I mean, look, he has been convicted. That's happened in a court of law, so it's a judgment that, of course, we respect. He has had the whip removed and has been expelled from the Conservative Party. The way that Parliament works is that you are elected as an individual, so his seat in the House of Commons is his until he personally chooses to vacate it. There are mechanisms now through recall petitions that have been in place since, I think, 2015 from memory. So if he chooses not to, there are now mechanisms through which he can be removed from his seat and subjected to a by-election. I understand he has plans to appeal, but quite frankly, everybody in government respects that a court of law has found him guilty, and that must be the judgment until he appeals successfully.
Well, Crispin Blunt doesn't, does he? I mean, he's a Tory MP. He's literally talked about how his friend is innocent. He describes it as a dreadful miscarriage of justice and nothing short of an international scandal. Does the government distance themselves from the comments of one of their own?
Yes.
That's fairly straightforward. Do you expect him to retract it?
I don't know, because I have no idea what it is that Crispin is referring to in the comments that he said. All I know is that in a court of law yesterday, Mr. Khan was found guilty. And I think every one of us who believes in the judicial system and the rule of law has to respect that judgment. And I think it's for Crispin to account for his words, but it's not something the government associates itself with.
Should he keep the whip?
Again, I think that it's for people to look at today as they speak to Crispin, find out what this is all about. But what matters is that absolutely nobody in Her Majesty's government is seeking to be critical of the decision of the court. If Mr. Khan chooses to appeal, that is for him. But a court of law has found him guilty, and that is what the government believes him to be there for.
Yeah, and you would be content if Mr. Khan decided that the best course of action was for him to resign, triggering a by-election?
Well, I think that that is a judgment for him. But as I've said, there are now parliamentary mechanisms to ensure that people who have been found guilty of crimes that require a prison sentence, and in fact, actually through the recall petition, those who haven't required to go to prison but have been found guilty of a crime can be subjected to a by-election if that is the will of their constituents. This is ultimately, however, a parliamentary process. Mr. Khan has been removed from the Conservative Party and had the whip removed from him in Parliament as well.
It would be of no concern to the government if a by-election was triggered in a red wall seat that was actually won by the Conservatives for the first time, certainly in a very long time, if ever, and the ramifications of that.
Oh, I mean, I see what you're driving at, Kay, but I just don't think the politics is the most important issue here.
It's a very good way of putting it. I wondered if I could ask you about Rishi Sunak. Are you supportive of the Chancellor and the way he and his wife's finances are being conducted?
Yes, I am. I mean, I think that he has been clear about what the arrangements are. He has recognised that even after his reassurances, people still wanted some further reassurance, so he's referred himself to Lord Geit. But I think Rishi is pretty straightforward, pretty straight talking, and he has been pretty clear on what the circumstances are.
And the fact that the Labour leader describes his behaviour as rank hypocrisy, what would be your response to that?
Yeah, well, I don't think it is hypocritical, because I don't think that anybody is saying that Rishi hasn't paid the tax that he is supposed to. So I just don't get where Keir Starmer is coming from with that comment. I also saw some sort of comment that suggested that because Rishi has been successful in his life before politics, he's therefore out of touch. And I think that also is ridiculous. You yourself, Kay, I think have on occasions challenged MPs and ministers about their competence and whether or not they are up to the job. Well, here we've got someone who has demonstrably been hugely successful in a career in finance before entering Parliament, and is now responsible for running our economy. And very obviously, I want people to be running the economy who have been very successful in the financial industry before coming into politics, because surely they are the best qualified with all the necessary experience and expertise.
But I would have two counters to that, if I may, Minister. One of them would be he was a green card holder, so he was resident in another country while he was deciding what the tax liability should be for the rest of us here in the United Kingdom. I wondered if you have a thought on that, first of all.
Well, whatever the green card circumstances are, and I have to say I'm not completely familiar with how that all works, but even if he was holding a green card whilst doing deciding on tax in this country, no one's ever suggested that he's done anything but pay all the tax that he is required to in the UK.
That's very true. But my point is that he's resident of another country, which he was until last October when he was the Chancellor. And yet, nevertheless, he felt able to offer his view and indeed law to decide how we paid our tax. And secondly, I have a friend who is a captain of industry who is a non-dom, but he still chooses to pay his tax in the UK because he says it's the right thing to do. And now I know that Mr. Sunak, you'll come back and say, does do that, but his wife did not until a spotlight was shone on that, and they have subsequently decided that they will change that. Is that because they are now doing the right thing and they didn't previously?
Well, I certainly think they're doing the right thing now, in that I think that it matters to the British public that they think that they know that their political leaders are paying their way and paying all of the taxes that they are due to. But to be clear, no one is suggesting that Rishi's wife ever avoided paying tax. She paid all the tax that she needed to on the income she earned in the UK. She had non-domiciled status because she is a foreign national, and she hasn't made herself resident in the UK for the purposes of tax and her business. She's changed that decision out of loyalty to her husband's political career, and there's a sort of unease, if you don't mind me saying, that in 2022 that is still something that she felt compelled to do to support her husband. But she never did anything wrong by being non-dom. She is an Indian national, and she pays her tax elsewhere. She's changed that out of loyalty to Rishi. I think that's very admirable.
Perhaps all pales when one thinks about what's happening in Mariupol at the moment. But we appreciate you taking the time to join us on the programme this morning, Minister. Thank you very much indeed. Let's find out what the papers are saying. Last stand is the headline in the Metro as Ukrainian forces in Mariupol prepare for another onslaught from Russia, but with their ammunition starting to run low. The Eye claims an exclusive with details of what it says are Russia's plans to resettle displaced Ukrainians in the Far East and the Arctic Circle. The Guardian leads with an attack by Labour leader Keir Starmer on the Chancellor Rishi Sunak over his wife's tax affairs, accusing him of being an out-of-touch hypocrite. Just put that to the minister. The Express leads with a plea from campaign groups for more help for pensioners suffering from the huge rise in the cost of living. And the Mirror focuses on the case of one couple who say they'll never be able to afford to switch their heating on again. And the Mail says that emergency plans are being drawn up to avoid travel chaos at ports and airports, ruining people's Easter breaks. Still to come on the programme for you this morning, 7:30, as fears grow that Russia could be about to deploy chemical weapons in Ukraine. Going to be joined by the former Chief of the General Staff, General Lord Richard Dannett. Then at around about 20 to 8, joined by the US political commentator and journalist Scotty Nell Hughes for all the latest on Johnny Depp's multi-million-dollar US defamation lawsuit against his ex-wife, Amber Heard. And shortly after 8, we'll get Labour's reaction to all of this morning's developments at home and overseas with the shadow leader of the House of Commons, and that's Tangam Debonair. Airlines once again under fire for being woefully understaffed, as we heard, and head into the Easter weekend, with many cancelling flights last minute. Well, on Monday alone, 64 British Airways flights were cancelled. 25 EasyJet flights were cancelled yesterday as well. Let's find out more about what's going on. Maddie's standing by for us this morning at Heathrow. Hi, Maddie. What's the prediction for today?
Good morning, Kay. Well, the fear is that the disruption is going to continue all this week leading up to Easter. It's what happens when huge increase in demand for holidays, people booking again, meet staff shortages. During the pandemic, the travel industry, thousands and thousands of jobs were lost as people just didn't feel confident booking. The restrictions yo-yoed. People didn't know whether they could go or not. In response, jobs were lost. And now airline operators, airports, they're all trying to hire those staff back, recruit more staff. But it's taking much longer than they expected, they say, to get them vetted, to get their security clearance. And so you've got this backlog, people trying to hire more staff to help deal with the increase in demand. And it's just not happening quick enough. And that's exacerbated then by COVID absences, COVID sickness-related absences amongst their existing staff. So it's sort of a perfect storm. And the fear is it's not going to just lead up to Easter, but continue all summer, as it takes a while to get staff levels back up to pre-pandemic levels.
Maddie, thanks very much indeed. Thanks a lot. I think the big key is if you are heading off for the Easter break, check before you leave the house. Breaking news to bring you now concerning the cost of living crisis. Let's find out more, should we? Our correspondent Paul Kelso standing by with the details. Hey, Paul, tell us more.
Yeah, good morning, Kay. More news from the Office for National Statistics this morning, confirming what many people will already know from their weekly and monthly paychecks, which is that average earnings are not keeping up with the rate of inflation. The ONS say this morning that wages in real terms have fallen 1%. That's minus 1% in the 3 months to February. That's despite wage increases on average at 4%. When you include bonuses for those lucky enough to get them, wage rises are running at 5.4%, but with inflation running at over 6%, there's just simply not enough to keep up with the real price of outgoings. We know about energy, we know food prices are increasing across the board. So this confirmation that the price of the cost of living squeeze is tightening. There is slightly brighter news in these numbers about the state of the labour market. Unemployment has fallen again, down to 3.8%, but we have this great curiosity in the labour market, two record figures. There are nearly 1.3 million vacancies, that's jobs that need to be filled, employers seeking to fill them, and a record number of people on payrolls, almost 30 million. So a labour squeeze, inflation rising, employers working, it looks on the face of it quite hard, some of them to keep up with inflation, but not managing to keep the money that people are being paid in their pockets to anything like keep up with rising prices.
OK, thanks very much. Thank you, Paul. Looking at some of today's other headlines on the programme for you now. And a court has heard how a robber threatened to cut former England footballer Ashley Cole's fingers off with pliers during a violent break-in at his home. Nottingham Crown Court was told the ex-Chelsea and England star was cable-tied and led around the house in just a pair of shorts during the ordeal. A four-strong gang who in January 2020 smashed their way into Cole's home with a sledgehammer before stealing jewellery and mobile phones. More than half of the global population are affected by headaches every year. The results published in the Journal of Headache and Pain suggest more than half of the world's population have an active headache disorder, typically described as experiencing some type of headache during the past year. A group of senior MPs has warned the government needs much more ambition and focus to tackle the shocking collapse in rape prosecutions. The Commons Home Affairs Committee says unacceptably low numbers of suspects being taken to court for rape and sexual offence will continue without stronger reforms to the criminal justice system. The US has ordered its non-emergency consular staff to leave Shanghai amid unrest over COVID-19 measures. Let's find out more, should we? Standing by for us in Beijing is Tom. Hi, Tom. Good morning to you. So the latest from the US is that they want some of their staff out because they're unsure about what happens next.
Yeah, exactly that, Kay. Last week they said that anyone who wanted to leave could leave Shanghai from the consulate there. What they're saying today is that everyone who's non-emergency has to leave. That's how worried they are about what's happening there. And you wouldn't really want to be in Shanghai right now. We've seen the scenes of looting. We've seen people locked in their compounds, demanding more food from the government. And I think also the issue that was raised last week of separation of children from their parents in case of positive COVID test, that's all contributed to this decision. It's likely to go down badly with the Chinese government. They criticised that advice last week, so this mandatory evacuation with staff leaving on commercial flights isn't going to go down well with the Chinese Foreign Ministry. They're trying to put a different spin on things in Shanghai. We did see a drop in cases for the first time in about 2 weeks, so 25,000 odd cases registered in the last 24 hours. So that might suggest it's on the way to some sort of permanent decrease. What we're also seeing is some residents have been allowed outside of their locked rooms and are now allowed to walk around either inside their residential compounds or perhaps even onto the street. I mean, nothing's open in Shanghai. It is still in lockdown effectively, but signs perhaps of life. The bigger worry is what's happening really all across China, whether those scenes in Shanghai will be repeated with lots of other cities building those quarantine centres, those sort of thing you're seeing on your screen right now, those huge exhibition halls with space for thousands of people. That's That's the Chinese approach. There are worries that approach is costing Li Keqiang, the Chinese Prime Minister, warning of increased downward pressure on the economy. But there's no chance, despite that, China is going to give up on its dynamic zero-COVID policy.
Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to The Breakfast Show here on Sky News. Tuesday morning, in the last half an hour, the Armed Forces Minister has told this programme the government is keeping all options on the table after the Foreign Secretary says that the UK is investigating new reports of a possible chemical attack in Mariupol. James Heapy also told me he believes the use of chemical weapons are beyond the pale.
It's important to recognise that there are all sorts of ways in which these things could be used, from the use of tear gas, which is effectively a riot control measure, all the way through to utterly devastating, lethal chemical weapon systems. So I don't think it's helpful to be too binary about the situation, because these are highly nuanced. But I also think it's very important to be very clear with your viewers, who I think have a deep sense of what is right and what is wrong, that there are some things that are beyond the pale, and the use of chemical weapons will get a response, and all options are on the table for what that response could be.
Ali's here. No messing around there.
No, all options on the table. I think he was very clear that if these reports are verified, and we know that that's something the Foreign Office are doing, this is going to be a very serious moment, and potentially a moment of worrying escalation. We know that chemical weapons were really a line that the West did not want Russia.
Red line, I think.
A red line, exactly. Yeah, you're right. He said that it will trigger a response in kind. We heard James Heapy there saying that we need to retain a level of ambiguity over what exactly that means, but he did say that it is beyond the pale and that all options, as you say, are on the table. So I think it is a very worrying moment in this war.
He also talked about a former Conservative MP. I mean, he's still an MP at the moment, an independent MP, because the whip has been removed, and whether or not he should, talking about the fact that he was convicted of child sex offence yesterday, whether or not he should resign. Now, that would trigger a by-election, wouldn't it?
Yes, so it's a bit complicated, but the only way that Imran Khan, who is, of course, the MP for Wakefield, won that seat, one of the moments of the election night in 2019, the only way he will go now is if he gets a custodial sentence of more than a year. That means that automatically there'll be a by-election in Wakefield, or if he chooses to resign, or if he gets a custodial sentence of less than a year, that could trigger what's known as a recall petition, which means enough of his constituents want him gone, then there will be a by-election. So that is interesting, particularly, I think, given that this is a red wall seat, the sort of seat that Labour really need to be winning if they want to do well in the general election. But I think you also have the extraordinary backlash after Crispin Blunt's overwhelming support yesterday for Imran Khan. He tweeted to call this a miscarriage of justice. That is something that James Heapy clearly wanted to show that the government were distanced from. He said that that is not a view held by anyone in His Majesty's government. He said absolutely no one in His Majesty's government is seeking to be critical of the decision of the court. We're saying a Tory source has suggested to us that we expect that statement from Crispin Blunt might be retracted this morning, and you will be speaking to him very shortly. Not Crispin Blunt, actually. We're going to be speaking to Chris Bryant. That's right.
Yeah. But if Crispin Blunt's watching this morning, please feel free to come and talk to us on the programme. Very interested to hear what you have to say about those comments that you made yesterday, or whether indeed you will be withdrawing them, Mr. Blunt. That's certainly the view that we are hearing this morning. And Chris Bryant, who has resigned, along with 3 others as a result of his comments, will be chatting to him, as you quite rightly say, Ali, in the next hour. Meantime, let's find out more about the latest developments in Ukraine, and we're joined by the former Chief of the General Staff, General Lord Richard Dunnett. Hello, my Lord. Thank you for joining us on the programme. Your reaction, first of all, this morning, if I may, on the suggestions that there has been a chemical attack not yet confirmed in Mariupol.
Well, Kay, I think this is quite possible that at some point the Russians might decide to use chemical weapons. I think we also have to look at who's now in command of the operation in the east of Ukraine, General Alexander Dornikov, who established a pretty fearsome reputation in Syria. And certainly in Syria, there is clear evidence that he and Russian forces in support of the Syrians use chemical weapons. So I'm afraid it's quite possible that we might see chemical weapons being used. Reports are unconfirmed at the present moment, but I think, as James Heappey said earlier, something like this is beyond the pale, but it's not beyond possibility.
And being beyond the pale as far as the West is concerned, it's been described as a red line, as you were just hearing us discuss there by President Biden at the end of last month. Our Prime Minister has said the same. But what does that mean? What options are available if that is the case?
Well, this is where, again, as James Heappey said, they want to keep a degree of ambiguity about what they actually mean. I think hitherto NATO has been quite sensible not to set firm, hard red lines, because once you set a red line and say, if this action takes place, then we will do this, that, or the other. And if you do cross that red line, then you become a bit hollow if you don't carry out that action. Now, what the West has got in mind is open to interpretation, is deliberately ambiguous. I mean, I think there's a whole range of things that can be done. Yes, it sounds a bit soft to say to significantly increase, once again, economic sanctions and sanctions on senior leaders in Russia, stepping up even further the weapons being made available to the Ukrainian army. But again, that's already being done. Then you have to get into the sort of realm of speculation. Would NATO really choose to get actively involved using major weapons below the nuclear threshold? We certainly wouldn't use chemical weapons ourselves. That would be contrary to everything that NATO has ever stood for. So there is a degree of ambiguity there. But again, the West has got to make it absolutely clear, just as we're accusing Russia quite properly of war crimes, the indiscriminate shelling of civilians, which they've been carrying out very widely, that we know about. Pressure has got to be continued to be piled on Putin and his senior people, that there are some things that are totally unacceptable and some things that fall somewhat more within the rules of war. But virtually everything the Russians have been doing is pretty much outside the conventions of war currently.
You've spoken the last couple of times I've spoken to you, my lord, about on the edge of genocide. If I were to press you again this morning?
Well, I think they are closer still. The accounts that are emerging, particularly from the north, now that the Russian troops have withdrawn from the areas around Kyiv, a number of the things that have been reported and well documented now very much add up, certainly to war crimes. And when you put a large list of war crimes together, you have to ask yourself the question, what is all this about? Are they actually trying to remove this whole group of people, by which I mean the Ukrainian population itself? We know that Russia wants to control Ukraine, but it's an awful thought to actually even consider. Do they want to control Ukraine without its people? Everything that they are doing, and this is what we're seeing now with this suggestion of chemical weapons, is to force the people to flee from their homes, flee from their areas. And it all does add up to an increasing catalogue of war crimes that increasingly looks like genocide. And I've said this before, Kay, whether we'll ever put Putin in a court of law, I don't know, but the court of history will absolutely damn him when the full record comes out.
Yes. Talk to me about the refugee scheme, particularly as it relates to the United Kingdom. I know that you, from personal experience, are pretty disappointed about it, my lord.
Well, Kay, you're right. I mean, we all know that a tremendous number of people have been displaced internally in Ukraine, and a very large number have now left Ukraine. Whether or not they actually want one day to go home isn't really the issue, but they need safety and sanctuary. And European Union countries have been pretty open-armed, if you like, in accepting Ukrainian refugees. The United Kingdom, by contrast, has put together, despite what the rhetoric from the government is, we've put together a pretty complicated system. The form filling is very onerous. And if I say there are ridiculous things, such as, or should I say, it would be much better if a family only had to make one application. Typically, it's a mother and 1 or 2 or 3 children filling in one application. But we've got a situation whereby even a 2 or 3-year-old child has to have a separate application, and answer quite ridiculous questions for a 2-year-old child, asking what sort of former employment that they have been in. Have they been involved in the armed forces? Well, typically and quite obviously, this is not. And all this has translated into a very large number of applications being processed by the UK Visa and Immigration Service at a speed that's horrendously slow. I'm personally involved with a group of 6 Ukrainians who have managed to get out of Ukraine. They originally got into Krakow, where they filled in their application forms. They've now made their way across Europe into an Airbnb in Dunkirk. And they will cross over to this country, to homes that are ready and waiting for them, including my own. But they haven't got their visas. And although one's tried to elevate their case, for example, it's rather like whistling into a howling gale. One doesn't seem to be able to get a response from the authorities at all. I think we really have to look at our system, look and see if we can simplify it, and it is jolly complicated. Look and see if we can simplify it so that we can be genuinely welcoming to people who have been through terrible trauma, and there are homes in this country where they can be safe and secure and welcomed. We really must do that for these people and not just talk about it.
So the beds are ready at your lovely home in Norfolk. You just can't get the Ukrainian people who you've promised them to over the border. What would you say to the Prime Minister in a sentence this morning? We know they watched the show.
I would say look urgently at the system that we are using. Ask ourselves whether it's too complicated. Ask ourselves whether we've got enough people working the system to make sure that applications are handled and processed as quickly as possible. Frankly, it is taking too long. Larissa and Bodan Bobor are in an Airbnb in Dunkirk when we have bedrooms and facilities here ready to welcome them. Let's just get the paperwork done, then they can travel, and maybe they can have a decent Easter weekend as opposed to being stuck where they are at the present moment.
In the meantime, we are hearing that Russia, as a final thought from you, Lord Dunnett, are taking hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians across the border against their will into Russia. My understanding is that that is also a war crime. Is that right?
Well, if people are being taken to where they don't want to go in an enforced manner, yes, that is a war crime. Under the rules of war, civilians have an absolute right to be protected. And to be removed to Russia if they don't want to go to Russia is indeed another version of a war crime. And I'm afraid, Kay, we're going to see an intensification of the fighting in the east. Quite sensibly, the Ukraine government has been urging people to leave and to come west to get away from the area of fighting. And we're going to see a very concentrated Russian attack over the next few days and weeks, because Putin is determined to have some kind of victory that he can celebrate on the 9th of May, their Armed Forces Victory Day.
Yeah, indeed. So 9th of May coming up very soon. Thank you very much indeed for joining us as usual, my lord. Thank you. Hopefully those refugees that you are hopefully offering a home to will be with you before too long. Thank you.
Thanks, Kay. Hope so.
So we're hearing, as I just said there, that 400,000 people in Ukraine have been taken across the border to Russia against their will. Meantime, allegations of a chemical attack in Mariupol, which is urgently being investigated by the West. What on earth is happening in Moscow? Diana Magnay standing by.
Militia units from the self-declared Donetsk People's Republic moving through what's left of Mariupol. Ukrainian forces surrounded, preparing for what they call today the final battle. And even these Russian-backed separatists admit it's been a hard fight.
Думал, будет лучше, думал быстрее, проходит все медленно. Медленно. Украинцы уже подготовленные, бойцы уже. Натовцы их поднатягали хорошо.
As Russia's Ministry of Defense released fresh video claiming they'd taken out more Ukrainian positions, Russia's foreign minister told State TV there would be no let-up in the fighting.
Когда мы убедились, что украинцы и не собирались отвечать взаимностью, было принято решение, что на последующие раунды переговоров никаких пауз не будет, пока не будет достигнута окончательной договоренности, пока она не будет подписана.
Russians have rallied behind their president over these past 6 weeks. His approval ratings, even with independent pollsters, now at more than 80%.
В Украине не победа будет. В Украине будет освобождение наших собратьев, наших славян, людей, которых угнетали, уничтожали очень долго.
Are you worried about what's happening in Ukraine, what Russia is doing?
Ну, конечно, беспокоит, конечно. Некрасиво. Война — это всегда нехорошо, это раз. Во-вторых, санкции. Жить стало трудно. Люди гибнут. Там, здесь бомжуют, там гибнут. Конечно, это все плохо.
But it will still be some time before the economic squeeze from sanctions really kicks in. And when it does, the Kremlin will have one message for its people, however untrue that is, that none of this was our fault. Diana Magnay, Sky News, Moscow.
Situation with Ukraine causing some problems at the pumps here as well, problems with fuel getting into the UK via Europe from Russia. 1,200 fuel pumps have now been closed in the UK. Also, problems with Extinction Rebellion. So what does that mean for you and me as we head towards the Easter weekend? Fair Fuel UK campaign. Howard Cox is with us. Hi, Howard. Good to talk to you. How concerned are you about what's going on?
Good morning. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, I'm getting bombarded with emails and communiques from supporters and drivers across the country who are thoroughly fed up with what's going on. There's really no need to do this. Protesting, I'm all for. Their objectives are sound. It's not a problem. But to actually interfere with the fuel supply chain, and especially approaching Easter when there's 20, it's probably one of the most busiest weekends on the road, it's going to cause chaos. And problems. We're already facing high fuel prices and ridiculously high fuel prices, and these protesters are making it worse. It seems to be a fashion to them.
I went to fill up my vehicle yesterday, actually, and I have to say of about, I think there were 40 pumps and only 4 of them actually had fuel. I suppose you have to start to be anxious that we're going to be seeing fuel rationing potentially. What's your advice to motorists?
Well, obviously, it's pot luck at the moment, where particularly in rural areas we're finding in the south, everything below the Midlands, etc., is being hit most, because that's where most of the protests are, from the oil depots. My advice to motorists is to be patient, take your time. The fuel is available and it's going to get there. It's not a problem. There's no need to panic buy. But at the moment in time, what we should be seeing is the government doing much more to stop making sure the fuel supply chain is secure and protected.
And what form would that take for you? Because, of course, these protesters would say they're acting on behalf of all of us because they're trying to save the planet.
Well, they're not acting on behalf of all of us. The majority of people want to go around their normal life, go to work, take their kids to school, go to hospitals, etc. They need their vehicles, especially in rural areas where public transport is pretty poor. They need to recognise that their approach for protesting is actually alienating their argument. It's not working well. What we need to do, and I challenge them, I'm happy to sit down in front of a Sky camera with these protesters and talk about the issues they're talking about, and I would actually give them the science, not the emotion.
What do you want the government to do?
Well, I'm pleased to see that Keir Starmer's Labour Party have actually called for injunctions on these people. We need those, and we need more police actually policing these depots to allow the tankers to get out and to deliver. The government must do more on that. Talk is cheap. I hear Ben Wallace is saying it's terrible, and I hear Priti Patel that these eco-terrorists, they are eco-terrorists. We should stop them. But they're not doing enough. The talk is cheap. They've got to get out there and make sure our roads are clear for tankers to travel down to deliver bulk fuels to our forecourts.